What is up, everybody? TJ Hernandez here, the director of DFS at 4for4 Fantasy Football. And today I am going to give you the intro to being a successful Best Ball Mania player, specifically on Underdog Fantasy and the Best Ball Mania 3 tournament. We are going to be going over the positional allocation, how many players you want to be drafting at each position. Before I get into that, if you enjoy this video and all of our videos here on YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe. It helps out a ton. But to cover what is the backbone of being a good best ball player and a good best ball player on Underdog specifically, positional allocation is what I call the skeleton to being a good player. It is how many players you're going to draft at each position, and kind of the premise for it is based on the draft capital you are using at each position, how often you're drafting players early in your draft. So, for example, if you're drafting 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds, you're going to draft fewer running backs in your draft on that roster. So I'm going to go position by position here and talk about how many players you should be drafting at each position and just some very basic things to think about when you're going through the positions. So starting at quarterback. At quarterback, you should almost always be coming away with 2 to 3 quarterbacks. Now, over the last 2 Best Ball Mania tournaments, what we've seen is that the 2 quarterback builds have advanced to the first round of the playoffs at an above average rate in both Best Ball Mania tournaments. Even though 3 quarterback has been below average both season, it isn't a strategy that we want to completely dismiss. If we go back to the first Best Ball Mania tournament, the winner of Best Ball Mania 1 did use a 3 quarterback build. The argument against 3 quarterback builds is that quarterback ADP has become so efficient in recent years that we usually want to be coming away from our drafts with 2 of the top 12 to 14 quarterbacks. The quarterbacks beyond that range just don't give us the upside that we're looking for to win a tournament of this size. Best Ball Mania this year being over 400,000 entries. So we really want to be nailing our picks, maximizing the upside as much as possible. So when we can, when the draft falls correctly, it's great to come out with 2 quarterbacks. Now that's not always possible. If you aren't able to land a top 12 quarterback, or if your second quarterback is very weak, then it is okay to land with 3 quarterbacks. Anything more than that, you're probably wasting roster spots. Another downside of 3 quarterback is you can't use one of those players to fill your flex, obviously. Underdog Best Ball Mania has a flex option for your running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Obviously, the more quarterbacks you have on your roster, the less opportunities you have to fill that flex. So that's another reason I like to draft 2 quarterbacks on my best ball teams. Now, if you look at the playoff advance rates, you will see that the advanced percentages aren't that big of a difference. So 3 quarterback isn't as horrible as some of these other bad positional allocations, but typically I want to trend towards 2. Moving on to running backs. When you are drafting a Best Ball Mania team, again, 18 roster spots, you typically want to end up in the 5 to 6 running back range, but there are arguments for having as few as 4 or as many as 7. But for the vast majority of your drafts, you're going to want to come away with 5 or 6 running backs. Again, going back to our advance rates, looking at the advance rate tool on 4for4.com, we see that teams that used 5 running backs and 6 running backs had advance rates above expectation in both Best Ball Mania tournaments. Now, if we go back to the first Best Ball Mania tournament, 4 running back was actually very successful. We saw a very high advance rate from 4 running backs, but that dipped in the second Best Ball Mania tournament. That advance rate really fell off. It's still a viable strategy for running backs if you start very strongly. And I think if you end up with 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds and maybe your running back 4 before round 12 or 13, you're still okay with 4 running backs. But typically you want to be coming away with 5. 7 running backs is almost always going to be too many. When we get into some of the more advanced roster construction type discussion, you'll see that when you do have a 0 running back build, sometimes a 7 running back build might be optimal. But those drafts are very few and far between. It's not something that you should be forcing. What is good about these builds with 4 or 7 running backs is those extreme builds have shown very unique upside. 2 years ago in Best Ball Mania 1, we saw 4 running back builds advance to the final round at a very high rate. And in Best Ball Mania 2, we saw 0 running back teams constructed with 7 running backs advance past the first round at a very high rate. But typically, like I said, the majority of your drafts, you should be coming away with 5 or 6 running backs. Moving on to wide receivers, the discussion on wide receivers is pretty simple because our wide receiver strategy is typically going to be tied directly to our running back strategy. So with 18 roster spots, with the ability to start 3 wide receivers, and again, going back to that flex, you typically want to be landing on 7 to 9 wide receivers. As I mentioned, how many you draft is almost always going to be a direct function of your early round strategy. If you start running back heavy in your draft, you're probably going to trend more towards those 8 or 9 running back builds. If you start very strong at wide receiver, say 3 in the first 4 rounds, sometimes you could get away with as few as 7, but we usually want to be in that 7 to 9 range. Very rarely are we going to be any higher than that. I would suggest never being lower than that. 6 is almost always going to be too few. There are some very extreme builds. Again, going back to the 4 running back build, if you end up with just 2 quarterbacks and 2 tight ends, you can justify 10 wide receivers. For the most part, you want to be coming away with 7 to 9 wide receivers. If we look at the advance rates for teams that used 7 to 8 wide receivers, they have been above average in both Best Ball Mania 1 and Best Ball Mania 2. That's what we're looking for to get us past the first round. So that is the sweet spot for wide receivers. Moving on to tight ends. Tight ends, very similar to quarterback. We want to end up in that 2 to 3 tight end range. The difference with tight ends and quarterbacks is, 1, we could use our tight ends in the flex. 2, there isn't overwhelming data for 2 or 3. This is the range we want to be in, but we should be very fluid at this position between our drafts. This is probably the biggest variance we're going to see in our positional allocation based on our early round draft capital. Every draft, there's only a few early round tight ends available, but typically if you do get a tight end in, say, the first 3 to 4 rounds, you're going to come away from that draft with 2 tight ends. It's almost always going to be a 2 tight end build. If you draft a tight end in the middle rounds, say rounds 5 through 10, it's really going to vary based on personal preference on how strongly you believe in your tight end 1 and how confident you are, or how late you take your tight end 2. That will determine how many tight ends you end up with on your roster. And if you wait very late to get your tight end 1, that should almost be a 3 tight end build. The one thing I would mention about 3 tight end builds and 3 quarterback builds, we've typically seen rosters that use 3 quarterbacks and 3 tight ends succeed very poorly. So we want to be avoiding those 3 quarterback, 3 tight end builds. Again, going back to maximizing that flex position. The more players that we can have in our flex that can give us those upside spike weeks, we're going to have better weeks. So just to recap, our quarterbacks typically want to end up with 2 to 3. Our running backs, we typically want to end up with 5 or 6. Wide receivers, 7 through 9 is the sweet spot. And tight ends, just like quarterbacks, want to end up with 2 or 3. So hopefully that gives you a very solid foundation on how you should be drafting your teams on Underdog in the Best Ball Mania tournament. If you want some more advanced tips, go check out the Best Ball Mania Bible on 4for4. Thank you for listening.